how did you actually start? I mean, starting a
I didn't
daily...
know what I didn't know, which I think is a place that we probably all begin in our careers. When I was hired at the Times-Herald to do this job, I was hired with the understanding that if I had any problems, I simply would ask somebody who knew and they would help me do it. And because I was so unprepared for that kind of professional role, I didn't know what kind of questions to ask. And I probably, at that stage of my life, pioneered a lot of material and a lot of information that I wouldn't have done if I had known better. It's a matter of just doing and then finding out later. And I used to say that they have no idea what I don't know. And that's just as well, because I then can go on and make that breakthrough.
Now, what year did you come to the Times-Herald, and what state did you find the women's pages in? What were they doing at that time?
It was a traditional women's pages in every sense of the word. It was called Women's News. They covered food, fashions, and what I like to say, the 4 F's, foods, fashion, and frivolity. And they covered those well. I have no quibble with the way the things were covered at that time. Society was covered with a capital S. It was what the 400 in town were doing and how they were responding to life, and it was the debutante balls and that sort of thing that was covered. And very early on, I started trying to cover society as I perceive it with the little s, which means all of humanity, the social structure of the community from the very first.
What year was this that you came
to the
Herald?
57.
57.
That was 1957. I had gone there in 55 and had stayed a year and a half, had gotten pregnant, left, resigned, and had gone back in 57 as the women's editor. And from that time on, began to do things that were not expected or accepted from that time.
Tell us a little about that.
Well, for instance, when I first went to work for the Times-Herald, the very word Planned Parenthood was not printed in the women's section. And I did not know that until I did it. And I learned that's one of the things that you learn by doing, that you can't, but what I did in doing that was not knowing was to make a breakthrough. And from then on, we covered Planned Parenthood, and it was an accepted thing for us to do. So I did a great lot of that kind of breakthroughs because I didn't know what not to do. I did it, and I learned that I did it. I always felt like that it was better to do and then to be told that was wrong than it was not to be sufficiently challenged to try to do it. And the thing was that so much of this material was, I thought, just things that everybody should be knowing and things that everybody should be doing, that I really was innocent in not knowing what not to cover and what not to reach for. So I covered abortion from the very first of going there, and I always knew when I covered anything that had anything to do with freedom of choice that my telephones were going to ring off the wall then for the next 2 weeks, and I probably wouldn't be able to do much of anything else because all of the people who were anti-choice would be calling. One of the things that I've always considered not sufficiently covered in any metropolitan newspaper in this country is the religion, because the background of religion impinges on all of our lives, whether or not it is organized or disorganized. It is still a strong given. So I covered the changing churchwoman and how the church impacts society and how it moves into our individual lives. We were one of the first people in the community to cover child abuse. Very first story on child abuse in Dallas that was ever written, we wrote, and we did it. And when I say we, I'm using the editorial we because, of course, I didn't do all of this, but I was in a position as the women's editor to assign the stories to a staff that then went out and prepared and covered these issues. I personally wrote the story on child abuse. I had been called from a friend of mine at the medical school who had uncovered a lot of things that were going on in the community.
Vivian, tell me a little bit about some of the problems you encountered with management and beyond. when you would cover some of these unconventional
and
stories.
See, you must remember that this was in 1957, and at that point in time, and still really a lot of times, most men, and remember that my entire management was comprised of men. I was the only woman in any kind of position of responsibility or authority. And so the whole framework was male. And at that time, every man judged or evaluated what was going on for women by what happened in his own home. And all of them had traditional wives. So the kinds of problems that I encountered were simply that the men did not think women thought of these things. My entire management they were puzzled for the most part. And a great many of the things that we did as breakthrough stories for human interest stories, we were doing against the grain of not only public opinion, and I always said to my staff, you must be far enough ahead that you make breakthroughs in journalism, but you must not be so far ahead that you lose your public. So some of the problems that I encountered they were puzzled by the fact that we were interested in these subjects, couldn't understand, and gave us a bad time because they didn't think anybody else was interested. Some of the specifics were sex education in the public schools. Why would anybody be interested in that? That was something that you talked about behind closed doors. And I think one of the fascinating stories that I can tell you is that very often as time went on, and I knew I was going to make waves, what I would do would be to prepare these stories and wait until my management went out of town, and then we would publish. Then I would get my hands slapped on Monday morning. And one of the specific things that I recall that we did was, at the time, the Dallas County Juvenile Home was in a very sad state. It was out on 9th Street, and it was a house, a big old rambling two-story house that was not really equipped for children. And there were a lot of children in a facility that had been set up for not more than 7. And there was no air conditioning, and it was over 100 degrees, and it was in the hot summertime. And I went out there, and the reporter who really wrote the story and I went together. And so on Sunday morning, we came out with the story that the children are crying on 9th Street. And on Monday morning, every Dallas County commissioner was in that place, and it's the first time they'd probably been in there since they've been in office. But very shortly after that, we had a new facility for children. And I don't think that we did all of it. I certainly don't take credit for doing that sort of thing, but it was simply another bridge into the community of what was going on there and what needed rectifying in the community, the changes that were made.
You did report to me earlier, I remember, that management kind of, well, let me characterize a little bit. I think they just never quite knew what was coming down the pike from the women's department.
No, they really didn't, and I think they were very uncomfortable with us.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that from time to time, I would get a new boss. I got lots of new bosses that I had to train. And I remember one time they hired this man, and he came in, and I had to report to him. And finally, in utter frustration with me, he said to me one time, "But Vivian Castleberry, I was hired to handle you." And I said to him, "Good luck. Better people than you have tried it."
And failed.
And failed. And it was just that, again, I can't take credit for doing these things. What I think happened was that I always felt this inner need that I was working for the public, and I was a public servant. And this was more important than any of the impediments that were put in the way. And along the way, Kurt would say to me, "Why are you trying so hard? Why don't you just do what they want you to, and don't try to do anything else, and just be happy doing what you're supposed to do?" And after all, he would remind me, they are paying your salary. They deserve to have what they want. And I kept saying to him, but it's not that simple. There is a reading public out there that we are supposed to be serving, and I am compelled to do that. And so I kept making the breakthroughs, although it was extremely uncomfortable for me at times. And there were a lot of times that the atmosphere in walking in was not altogether conducive to my best mental and emotional health.
Vivian, at the same time that you were in this busy career as a journalist and busy career as a wife and mother of 5 growing girls, you also were extremely active as
In
a
the
community
community.
leader in the Dallas community, especially the women's community. In fact, Ann Richards said that you were the godmother of the women's movement in Dallas. And can you talk a little bit about some of the activities
I think
you
she
were active
probably,
in?
yes, I'll get to be specific real quickly, but I think the reason she said that was that I, again, was the span. I was the bridge from what was going on in the community to the greater reading public, and that's probably the reason she assigned that. Specifically and personally, I was involved in all of the opening wedges of the women's movement and the children's rights movement and the custody movement, this sort of thing. The reason being because that's a part of the whole human being, and it's imperative to the whole of us that we take care of these little pieces. So I was one of the founding members of the Dallas Women's Center and of Women for Change. Prior to that, one of the 13 women as a founder, one of the founders of the Women's Issues Network, and one of the founders of the Executive Women of Dallas, and the different things that came along. Because I happened to be there and had collected information and people knew me and knew what I did, then I would be drawn in as one of the founders. And that was another thing where my management was not always comfortable. I started reporting the second wave of the feminist movement in Dallas almost before it had a name. I covered Friedan shortly after The Feminine Mystique was published. And then when Gloria Steinem first came to the city, Kurt and I were co-hosts for a party for her, and this was taken at the party. My paper was a little bit perturbed, but that was a personal thing I did that was a great and abiding joy. I was on the first Dallas Commission on the Status of Women, and because I wanted to do that and had been in the background, helped to put together all of the ingredients for that to happen, and had been in the background a political motivator in moving the city council and our elected officials to the point in time where this was possible. Then at that stage I knew that I could not take a public role without permission. So I went to my editor and I said to him, this is where I am and I want to do this. And I didn't say, do I have permission to do it? I said, these are things that here's the given and here's what I want to do about it. And I want to know what degree of comfort you have with that. And as a result, he said to me, I didn't say, may I never asked for permission. And as a result of it, he said, I'm perfectly comfortable with it as long as you do not take a leading position. So that was just great with me. I could be the undergirding framework to help things happen, and somebody else then would take the bows and whatever else came along. But that's how I managed to be involved in all of these as what I consider to be a change agent in the community for what was going on in women's and family issues in the community. And again, what was always so important to me was to do this so that all segments of the community was included. For instance, beginning in 1957, shortly after I went with the Times-Herald, I did an annual women's panel for the Times-Herald. That every year we had a women's panel that opened up issues that were significant to women. And because I put it together and ran it, what it really served for me was a way that I could get to what's going on in the community and what the people are thinking behind the scenes. And then it would provide a week of stories, plus the great bonus was that I then had a first-person, singular person in every segment of the community that I could go to for anything significant that was going on in that community. I knew who to ask. This is the first one. And the women in this are our staff members. We are at the back, and then the members of that year's panel are toward the front. And to your extreme right, the blonde that you see is Mrs. Henry Wade, who is the wife of the district attorney in the county. The only criteria for bringing these women in for this session was that they all had to be fairly exemplary homemakers in the community, and we brought them in from every segment of Dallas County. As the years went on, the mix became much more wonderful. We were brown and black and white, and I told them sometimes yellow and sometimes polka dotted, but we all represented what women were doing in their homes and with their families, whatever that family situation might be. As the years went on, we had single mother, head of household, and we even had a single father once. Marvelous things happened, such as the year that I seated the president of the Junior League next to the woman from South Dallas who lived in a housing project and whose 8 children were sleeping on the floor because they had no beds. And by the end of the day, the president of the Junior League had not only provided beds for all of the children, she had provided medical care for one of the children in need. So what it really did, what I found out very early on was that women underneath the top surface speak the same language. They all give birth. They're all there together. If you get that top layer off and they hear each other's human needs, that's all it requires. There's twice in one's life that you do a clipping in a newspaper and keep it forever, and one of them's when you're a bride and the other one's when somebody in the family dies. You clip those and keep it forever, and you always remember how the paper treated you at those times. So through the years, I got a lot of that. As I began to be known in the community for other things, people would call me about an obituary, and they would call me about other things that were personally significant to them. But those things had to be put into the whole dimension of what was going on in social issues in the community.
So it's not just that you in the paper address social issues that had not previously been covered in the paper. You also uncovered in that process the human side, with an understanding that the human side is the underpinning of what
the human side is where
going.
it happens, and nothing ever happens in a vacuum. The crime story that erupts on the front page tomorrow happened in a societal setting that made this possible. And what I was looking for was what is possible.